Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest narration of the web series The Survivor Becomes the Dungeon. If you're new to the series, there is a playlist listed down below in the description. And as always, I hope that you enjoy. Chapter 148. Tulmi Point of View. With the cleanup of the village well underway and fully managed by the Lukvan family, Tulmi had turned her focus and efforts back onto her own home. Walking through the doors of the Striking Cat Inn, she couldn't help but let out a soft sigh as she went over the damage that was left in the wake of the battle this morning. Tables and chairs were smashed and turned over. There were grooves and gouges from sword slashes and other kinds of weapon damage, and various sorts of decorations were ruined in some way or another. Not to mention the splatters of blood which have already soaked into the wood. At the end of the day, all these things are just that, things, and they can be replaced, cleaned up, or repaired as needed. She still has her life, and her daughter is alive and well. As long as that doesn't change, she can pick up the pieces and rebuild as many times as needed. As the minutes drifted by, she was joined by some of her employees as they helped reorganize the inn, working where they could now that they were done putting their own lives back together as much as possible for the time being. While dragging large chunks of shattered table out of the nearby pile of ruined furniture, her attention was grabbed by a small caravan coming into town, as they then pulled up to her inn in particular. After a moment of uncertainty ran through her mind, she was hit by a wave of relief at the realization that this must be Vito's caravan, and that Puma was likely with them. She watched as a well-dressed rabbitkin woman and a lizardkin man lined their carriages up beside each other before climbing down as a lizardkin began tending to the cheever steeds. The rabbitkin, for her part, made her approach as she walked up to Tulmi, seemingly noting the badge on Tulmi's shirt collar and respectfully lowering her head for a moment before standing tall again. "Good afternoon. I'm correct in assuming that you are Tulmi's Swiftstrike." Tulmi watched as a group of teens, followed by a wolf and some kind of white cub, began climbing out from the carriages, going about stretching their legs and popping their backs as needed. Turning her attention back to the rabbitkin, she flashed a smile before offering a small nod. "Yes, I'm Tulmi Swiftstrike. Who might you be?" The rabbitkin nodded in return before making and maintaining proper eye contact. "I am Riley, a representative of Merrill's General Goods and Sundries, currently in the employ of Mr. Vito," she explained, rather dutifully and methodically. Looking the rabbitkin over, Tulmi could tell that Riley was truly a professional merchant through and through, and that she clearly carried herself with the pride of her success in life. "And, who is Vito?" she asked leadingly, wondering if she could get more information about the powerful mage that seemingly appeared out of nowhere. Riley seemed surprised by the question, but responded after taking a moment to collect herself. "Mr. Vito is a rank 4 elite who is a reclusive art merchant that uses magic to create wonderful statues and figurines," she explained, though Tulmi felt that Riley was almost reading off a script, as if that was simply what she was told and she didn't actually know who Vito was. Just nodding at Riley's words, Tulmi glanced over the rabbitkin's shoulder and watched as a young foxkin man made his approach, followed by an oversized splitter wolf with a strange sword strapped to its side and the white cub from earlier riding on its back. "Now see, and what can I do for you?" she asked as she regarded Riley again. One of Riley's lobe ears twitched at the question, as she simply bobbed her head at the question. "The plan was to seek lodging at your inn," she started to say, while looking over Tulmi's shoulders as she saw some people dragging out more ruined furniture. "Though considering the circumstances, we understand if you're unable to take us in for the night," she mentioned before meeting Tulmi's gaze once more. "Puma, at her order. She is currently resting in one of the carriages, safe and sound, thanks to Mr. Vito's treatment." Tulmi's eyes wander over to the carriages again, a small smile on her lips as she gets verbal confirmation of her daughter's safety. Looking at Riley once more, Tulmi lowered her head in a show of thanks. "Never let it be said that the Striking Cat Inn was unable to provide for travellers that came to her doors. As thanks for making sure that my daughter returned safely, I'd be more than willing to provide you all a room and board, free of charge." Riley looked surprised by the offer, shaking her head at first when she spoke up. "I couldn't possibly accept that. We were only doing what was expected of us." Tulmi couldn't help but chuckle at Riley's expense, though she glanced behind the rabbitkin to see that the foxkin was waiting patiently behind her, for whatever reason. Taking a moment to glance over the rest of the group, she spotted a young mage along with a few capable-looking hands among their number. Looking back to Riley, as her tail flicked behind her, she spoke up once more. "Very well. If you don't feel comfortable with free lodging and food, then we could certainly use some help in fixing up the inn, amongst other things. We could especially use the aid of that mage if his choice of colours signifies the magic he specialises in," she mentioned, while gesturing to the short young human in question. Riley appeared rather thoughtful at Tulmi's proposition, her lope ears slightly twitching as she considered something before piping up again. "Well, I cannot speak for the group. I will gladly share the terms of your offer and come back with an answer soon," she explained, lowering her head and dismissing herself before turning to leave. She was momentarily surprised to see the foxskin with the spitterwolf and cub standing behind her, but recovered quickly enough as she stepped past them. As the foxskin stepped up, she recognized him to be another sort of professional with how he carried himself and how lightly he stepped. She knew enough rogues in her life to recognize one when she saw them, but it was none of her business at this point. She watched as his eyes quickly measured her up out of habit before finally meeting her gaze. "Excuse me, you wouldn't happen to know where I could find Boss Vito, would you?" he asked politely enough, as his tail flicked and swayed casually behind him. Tommy just shook her head before jutting her thumb over towards the plaza further up the street. "I don't know, but look for a human woman in vibrant blue gambeson. She would likely know where his whereabouts, if he's done helping out with where he said he would." The foxskin followed where she gestured before bobbing his head. "I see, thanks." And with that he dismissed himself as well before rejoining his group and approaching the younger foxskin, speaking with her before heading off on his own with the spitterwolf and cub. As the caravan continued to discuss what they would do, Tommy decided to make her way over to the carriages, peeking in the back before spotting Pulma lying in the second carriage. Tommy could feel her throat tighten with distress at first glance upon seeing her daughter. She looked like a wreck, her clothes having been drenched and now dried with her blood and the blood of her enemies. The tears in her clothes betrayed where Puma had suffered truly considerable battle damage, not to mention the spots of her fur around her shoulders and neck showing even more injuries that had signs of magically being healed and closed up. Seeing her wounds now, she could tell that it was a fool's errand for her daughter to have tried to run all the way to Sunspot Keep to call for help, though she knew in her heart that if Puma had stayed in the village and been captured as she had been, then Puma likely would have died from her wounds by the time Vito had turned up when he did. The only reason she survived her injuries might have been because Vito managed to find her when he had. Tommy just sighed softly, shaking the possibilities of what-ifs away as she looked over her daughter once more. Puma was alive and well, and that was all she needed to focus on. Looking around the back of the carriage, she spotted a water skin that looked like it still had something in it. Taking it up, she uncorked it before putting on a brave face and smirking as she began pouring it over the top of Puma's head. "Break time's over, back to work," she barked out, as if waking her daughter from her usual cat naps. Puma woke with a start, shaking her soaked fur as her hackles rose from the shock of the water. "Where? What?" she mumbled frantically, while still shaking herself, not quite awake just yet, while looking from side to side until she spotted Tulby, her fur still dripping as she seemed to collect herself. Mom, you're okay," she exclaimed excitedly, quickly pushing up off the floor of the carriage and stumbling over herself as she quickly clung to Tulmi, desperately hugging her with as much strength as she could muster. Tulmi returned the embrace eagerly, her hands gently rubbing her upper back while resting her chin against the top of Pulma's head as her daughter's ears twitched and flicked with clear distress and anxiety. There, you're okay. It's all over now," Tulmi murmured softly as she did her best to comfort her. Puma could only shudder as she desperately did her best to not openly sob, though Tulmi could tell that her emotions were bubbling up unbearably now that she was finally home safe. I failed. I didn't even come close to getting to Sunspot Keep. I thought that I was going to die up there. The last thing I could remember was losing all feeling in my legs before collapsing in the grass, just thinking about how cold I felt." Tulmi just nuzzled her chin against Puma's before breaking up once more. "Hush, it's okay. You didn't fail. The only thing that you had to do was fight and not die." Tulmi then pulled away a little, looking down into Puma's eyes as she brought her hand gently and cradled her daughter's cheek. "For your first real battle to the death against people, soldiers at that, you performed brilliantly. I couldn't be more proud of how strong you've become, my sweet little kitten," she enthused with a small smile. "Sure, you didn't make it to Sunspot Keep, but you did manage to find a powerful mage and send him our way. In that regard, you did more than enough." Boomer doesn't respond, just leaning in and hugging Tulmi tightly while burying her head into the crook of Tulmi's neck. Tulmi accepted the erase a while longer before putting on a smile as she patted Puma's back once more. "Come along, let's get you cleaned up. Larkus isn't real worried about you, you know. You should see how productive he's been in preparation for your return," she mused while slowly putting away again. Puma nodded a bit, letting out a shaky breath before managing to work a smile on her face. "Really? I suppose I shouldn't keep him waiting," she mused quietly, hugging Tulmi tightly once more before finally pulling away as she started climbing down from the carriage. The two made their way inside as they passed the caravan, who were still discussing something or another. Chris' point of view. Making his way into the plaza, Chris watched as villagers, guards and soldiers made their way from one end of the plaza to the other, busily working away at clearing up the village after whatever battle took place here. From where he stood, he could still see signs of battle here and there. Most obviously were the black burn marks on the stone of the bailey's walls, as well as the stray arrows that stuck out from the various wood fixtures. "You know, I was expecting things to look worse when we first got here. At the very least, a lot more fire damage after that giant pillar we saw earlier," he mentioned almost absently while looking over to Lugosi. The wolf in question looked up to Chris before smiling a little, though suddenly Chris heard Lugosi's voice in his head instead of being spoken aloud like before. "It's an odd sight, no? I think Boss Vito has something to do with it. I can smell his influence of his magic almost everywhere around us," Lugosi explained as he pointedly sniffed around some more, his tail slowly swaying behind him as they walked. Fraley moraled in agreement, and Chris got his impression that she was getting the same feeling as well. Chris was momentarily startled by the sudden display of telepathy, but quickly collected himself soon enough as he casually scanned their surroundings. "I see. Also, I guess it's good to know that you don't need to speak aloud if you don't have to," he said with a bit of a smile as he glanced at Lugosi. "A little warning next time. I'm not exactly proficient with all this magic stuff, you know." Lugosi just chuckled softly with amusement before his attention was seemingly grabbed by something. Turning to look, Chris spotted a small set of lines going up to some kind of heater station. From where he stood, he could see a group of 6 individuals, each tending to a villager in one way or another. Though, when he looked over at a man wearing a bird mask, the man seemingly looked over at Chris almost immediately in the next moment. When their eyes met, Chris got the strange sensation that they shared a bond like he had with Lugosi and Fraley, though the man in the bird mask quickly went back to what he was doing as he healed the purpling bruise of a half-orc child. "I guess the boss has more in his service now," Chris mentioned with uncertainty as he glanced over at Lugosi while they walked closer to the station. Though at that, Lugosi just shook his head before mentally replying, "No, you've been in the boss's Vito's service even longer than I have, but they're different now." Chris wasn't sure what Lugosi meant by that, but once they were at the station, he spotted yet another man in a different kind of bird mask, and got the same feeling all over again. Shaking off the sensation, he regarded the first man as they sent the child off, and the next patient made their approach. "Excuse me, do you happen to know where the boss is?" The first man in the bird mask looked to Chris for a moment before pointing up at the small castle beside the plaza. "He is resting. Find a member of the Lukfan family to go get him," he explained in a remarkably soft voice. It certainly sounded masculine, though it was as if it could barely muster more than a whisper. With that said, he proceeded to turn away from Chris and give an undivided attention to a patient in front of them, as they were the only thing in the world that mattered. Well, all right," Chris muttered with a sigh, once it became clear that he wasn't going to get anything else from the masked man, though that was when he heard the clanking of metal boots and stone. At first, a spike of worry shot down his back and along his tail at the thought of suddenly being accosted by guards, but then he realized that nobody knew him here, and he hadn't done anything particularly illegal yet, so he shouldn't be in trouble. Slowly bringing himself around to look at the approaching individual, he spotted a rather impressive-looking woman and a gnarly scar on her face and a clearly false eye. She was also sporting a vibrant blue gambeson, so she was likely the person the elite innkeeper mentioned. The woman flashed a charming smile, resting her arm on the pommel of her blade and bringing her other hand to rest against her hip. She pointedly looked Chris up and down before nodding to herself about something. "You certainly fit the description. You must be one of the Mage Vito's workers, right?" Chris nodded once, his eyes catching the badge on the woman's collar as he suddenly realized that he was standing before a rank 2 elite, standing just a little taller and deciding to play it safe by being more respectful than usual. "Yes, ma'am, that's me. My name is Chris. I take it you know where I can find my boss?" he asked before gesturing to Lugosi and Fraley. "I was asked to bring his familiars once we made it here," Chris explained while doing his best to sound professional. The elite woman just nodded intently, looking over Lugosi while noting his sword curiously, before flashing a little smile at Fraley. "Of course. I'll have one of my people show you the way then," she said as she looked around before waving over a soldier, who dutifully made their way up to the woman. "Guide them to Mage Vito's quarters," she ordered, before offering Chris a brief smile as she turned and made her way off. The soldier nodded before saluting as he smacked an armored fist against his chest. "Yes, ma'am, right away." He then glanced over at Chris before tilting his head towards what appeared to be a stone bridge. "If you'll follow me." Before long, Chris was being led into a bailey itself, and then further through the walls until he was inside a small castle. He soon found himself surrounded by a level of finery that he was not yet to experience. Everything from beautiful paintings, magnificent sculptures, and impressive-looking carpets that spanned entire hallways. He was led through several corridors before they finally stopped at a set of double doors. The soldier turned to face Chris when he offered a simple nod. "Mage Vito is inside. As a guest of the estate and the Lupin family, his people are welcome here. Have a good day now," he said, being surprisingly polite, despite not saying a single word the whole way here, as he turned to leave. With the soldier on his way, Chris looked over at the large double doors before rapping his knuckles against it. Boss, it's Chris. I've also brought Lugosi and Fraley." It took a moment, though soon the doors were being opened, much to Chris's vague surprise, as he didn't even hear footsteps approaching the door. What greeted him was a shirtless Vito, and Chris was suddenly rather aware of just how many scars littered his new boss's body. Vito just smiled a bit as he stepped away from the door while pulling it open the rest of the way. "Glad to see that you made it to the village safely enough. Did you encounter any trouble along the way?" Before Chris could step forward, Lugosi rushed ahead with Fraley, bounding inside while Fraley hopped off his back and trotted around the room. She stopped short and dashed out of sight. No, everything was quiet on the way over, boss. The only interesting thing that happened was meeting the elite girl that Lugosi brought over to the caravan," he explained simply enough as he made his way into the room. "That's good to hear," Vito commented with a small nod as he shut and locked the door behind him. Now standing in the middle of the room, Chris was once again floored by the sheer luxury of the place. Doing some quick mental math, he realized that his entire apartment could fit in this room with plenty of space to spare. Though, as he looked around, he suddenly noticed a small brown-skinned beeskin boy with pitch-black hair, wearing a raggly back poncho, just sitting there in the middle of a massive bed that was against one of the walls of the room. He was a catkin of some kind, with mostly human features, light brown skin with small mess of freckles across his nose. He had vibrant green eyes, rounded ears, and a long feline tail that curled into sheets behind him. He looked younger than Ren, possibly 8 or 9, but Chris couldn't be sure. Bailey sure was excited to see him, mewling excitedly with delight as she eagerly pressed her paws against his face. The boy looked vaguely annoyed by the attention, but smiled nonetheless. Boss, who's that?" Chris asked, not having realized that he had been standing there without saying a word for nearly a full minute, as he had been examining the room before being surprised by the sight of the kid. Vito looked confused for a moment, glancing over at Chris as he put on some kind of gambeson or coat as he pulled from thin air. Who's who?" he asked before looking over at the boy as a flash of realization seemingly dawned on him. Right, well, that's my son, Basmori," he said as he flashed a sheepish smile. End of chapter. I would just quickly like to thank the T5 peeps: Dragon Soup, Cold War Boomerwaffen, Sevaren Serberous, Red Panda 121, Leslie 517, Bushmaster 177, Casper Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, Sans the Skeleton, Light Jock, Dragzoon W.R.E, and Lord Asrigal. Thank you very much.